Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. So I wanted to just take an opportunity to talk a little bit more, both about the events that happened in Selma, Alabama in 1965, as well as our former rector, Tom Turnbull's participation in those. So I'll talk for a while, and then we're recording this section for those who aren't able to be here today. And also to make it available on our website. And then I'll turn off the recording and we can open it up to questions. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. So the reason that I know these things is because Tom's son, George, gave me a whole bunch of Tom's papers recently, last year at some point, and I was able to read through those and really kind of piece together both Tom's time in Selma, but also through the reflections of other people that he had held on to, kind of what was important to him about the movement. And that really sparked my interest in learning more about other Episcopalians' involvement, because I saw some of that in his papers as well, and found just some wonderful resources on our Episcopal Church archive that really delve into more of that. So some of it is available on our website if you ever want to remember some of the details of what we talk about tonight. But I thought I would start just with an overview of jog your memory about what happened in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. So, as I'm sure you know, though people of color were given the right to vote with the 14th Amendment, this right was very much quashed in a good part of the United States, and people weren't able to access their right. They were stopped from registering. They were bullied, and there were all sorts of different kinds of laws that were put into place, like taxes and literacy tests and things like that. So Selma, Alabama is in Dallas County, so not Dallas, Texas. It was a little confusing, but Dallas County, Alabama. And in that county in 1965, more than 50% of the people were African American, and only 1% of the registered voters in that county were African American. So you can see just the incredible oppression that was going on, and it was, of course, not for lack of wanting to register or trying. So for a number of years during the Civil Rights Movement, local protesters and activists were working on trying to call attention to the fact that they were being prohibited from voting or from registering to vote. So they were allowed to register to vote at the courthouse in the county center. But there was only one or two registrars that worked there, and they would change the hours all the time. So they would just post on the door, "No, we're not in today," and things like that to try to stop people. And so if you did finally, after standing in a long line, finally get into the registrar's office when they happened to be open, they would come up with all sorts of excuses of why they didn't want to register you to vote. So there could be hundreds and hundreds of people lined up to vote, and maybe only one person would get registered in a day. So they wanted to draw attention to this, so they started these demonstrations, and they would stand in lines, and they would come in large groups to the county courthouse, and they would talk about what it was that was happening there. And they started to gain some interest, but also some really negative backlash from the local police, who were really threatened, and they were strong segregationalists who were in control of the city, and so they did not want people to be able to register to vote. So it was interesting that they worked really hard on nonviolent techniques. So people were being educated. The center of the movement in Selma was based out of the AME Zion Church in Selma, and which was a large church, probably from the pictures looks like about at least twice as large as our sanctuary, and then it also had a balcony. And so they would have not just church services there, but during the week they would be doing trainings on nonviolent organizing. And so finally, this group puts on a demonstration just in another part of the county outside of town. And it happens at night, which is a more dangerous time to put on a demonstration, because those who would commit violence against others felt like there was more anonymity at nighttime. And in that confrontation, a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed by a state trooper. He was trying to shield his mother from a brutal attack by the same officer, and was killed. And so that made national news. It brought attention to the situation that was happening, and a call went out from those local organizers to those in other parts of the country to say, "Hey, come here to Dallas County to help us out." There was deep pain and obviously rage in response to the killing of this man. And so folks started to gather. They asked Martin Luther King to come. There was some disagreement among the group because there was a wing that said, the best way to make change is through the people on the ground, the grassroots efforts. And then there was another opinion that said, yeah, but we really need those famous people that are inspiring people like Martin Luther King and who are really making headlines and bringing attention. And so they kind of managed to walk the line of bringing both of those ideas together in Selma. So Martin Luther came and was thrown in jail as part of a demonstration with 200 other people in late February of that year. This was only 2 months after he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he went to the church that was the headquarters, and he preached there on Sundays and really helped to galvanize folks. And more people started showing up. The locals in town also really caught the whole community really caught the energy of what it was they needed to do. So the black teachers in town, all together went down to the courthouse to register to vote, and there were over 100 of them that went in a single demonstration. And it really captured the imagination of the community because the teachers were held in high esteem by people. They said the teachers also risked losing their jobs by doing this because it was a very public thing that they were doing, and the school board was controlled by segregationalists. So after the teachers, then the hairdressers, and then the lawyers, and each kind of professional group went together, and they also went to register to vote. And eventually, after all of this, the tension was growing, and police violence started to become more apparent right in front of the courthouse on national TV. And that just drew even more attention to the situation. So just after Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed, part of what they were trying to think about was how do we really raise this issue to the whole nation? And they thought, what we would like to do is carry his body to the state capitol in Montgomery. And through that march, which is 54 miles, it's going to take us 5 days, and the whole attention of the nation is going to be on us during those 5 days. And instead of just these little clips about violence that's happening or this that's happening, it'll be a sustained narrative that we will be able to contribute to for 5 whole days in the national news. So they really, the organizers were really passionate about this. And they decided to go ahead and do this march. They didn't take Jimmy's body with them, but they started out on the bridge on Sunday, over Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, on Sunday, March 7th in 1965. And the police knew that they were coming, and they had formed a blockade at the far end of the bridge. There were 600 people who decided to march. And at the very front of that row, that long line of people was John Lewis, the former congressman who passed away recently, and he was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were really worried about this march. They were really worried there was going to be violence, and so they kind of pulled out at the last moment. But he decided to go anyway, and so he led the marchers across the bridge. And they walked and they stood at a respectful distance from the police line that was mounted police and police with shields and helmets. And they just stood there. They had no weapons with them. There was no aggression in their manner. And they were speaking, they were praying. And the police told them to disperse, but then before giving them time to disperse, they charged. It's known as Bloody Sunday, and the news coverage of what happened. You can see some photos actually on our bulletin board, but they're very famous photos. They just descended upon people and with incredible force and violence. The police were wearing gas masks, so they threw tear gas and things like that. But people weren't able to flee; they weren't able to get away. 50 people were hospitalized. It's really amazing that no one was killed. And some of the marchers were as young as 8 years old. So they also were refusing to provide medical care for people or to let people go back to care for the wounded. So people really struggled through to try to help others and carried them back to the church because the white-run hospital was not willing to help people. And so they managed to do triage at the church and then send people to clinics and hospitals in the black neighborhood of town. So that coverage just really, at that point in the civil rights movement, there had been marches and demonstrations for a decade. And finally, people saw just in incredible detail just how far the segregationalist people in power were willing to go to hold on to that power. Martin Luther King then wrote, so he wasn't in that march, but he was very moved by what happened, and even those that had kind of decided to pull out of the march the last minute also wanted to do another march, and so they planned one for the next Tuesday, the 9th of March, and Martin Luther King sent out an invitation to clergy and people of faith around the country to come and join in that march. But then there was a court order and all sorts of things going back and forth that said that they shouldn't march because they couldn't be properly protected. But it was in the process of being approved through a federal court to provide federal protection for the marchers because this was a guaranteed right under the U.S. Constitution. But as you can imagine, the court system moves rather slowly, and there was a lot that was making that process slow. And so they didn't yet have approval on March 9th to complete the whole march. 2,000 people joined in that march, and they started out. They walked across the bridge. There was a police blockade again. They turned and they walked back in the other direction, and the police held their ground. They were under strict orders from the governor. A lot of people were really disappointed. Martin Luther King led that march. They were really upset with him because they said, "We came here to march, not to turn around and walk back." So there was a lot of tension, and people were trying to figure out what would happen next. But in that group of people, it was a really diverse group of people. There were a lot of white ministers who had come to Selma because Martin Luther King had asked everyone to come. And there were 3 Unitarians who went out to dinner that night after participating in the march. And they were brutally attacked after leaving their restaurant because the people in town knew that people from outside were coming in to support the movement. And a minister named James Reeb was killed in that attack. So he was beaten in the head and then died of those head wounds a few days later. So that also captured the attention of the nation, and much to the chagrin of some people in the movement who said, Jimmy Lee Jackson died just a couple weeks ago, and people did not pay attention to that. But a white man dies, and now the whole nation is paying attention. But needless to say that there was a lot more attention on what was happening in Selma. So I want to just share with you a few words from the letter that Martin Luther King sent out before the March 9th march, because Tom had kept that in his file. So clearly these were words that were really compelling to him, and I'm sure that he began to plan his trip to Selma when he received this particular invitation. So Martin Luther King said, this was on March 8th, "No American is without responsibility. All are involved in the sorrow that rises from Selma to contaminate every crevice of our national life. The people of Selma will struggle on for the soul of the nation, but it is fitting that all Americans help to bear that burden. I call, therefore, on clergy of all faiths, representatives of every part of the country, to join me in Selma for a minister's march to Montgomery on Tuesday, March 9th. So there was a sense that what was happening in Selma was much larger than the voting rights of that particular county, but rather with the eyes of the nation on what was happening there and the brutality really being exposed. It was a chance they hoped to produce some change. So they did finally get the court order approving the march, and the march was set for the 21st of March, the march to Montgomery. The Governor Wallace, again and again was trying to stop this from happening and refused to provide any kind of protection. Now, the reason protection was important was because the segregationalists who knew the march was happening would be lining the streets looking for opportunities to attack marchers as they attacked Reverend Reeb and killed him. So it was really important that they have proper protection. So Lyndon Johnson tried to meet with the governor, tried to win him over, brought him to the White House, and really said, this history is going to remember us if we do the right thing in this moment, and the governor still refused. So the president federalized the Alabama National Guard in order to provide protection. They had to do bomb sweeps and all sorts of things. There were helicopters involved in order to try to secure the route. But given the sheer number of people that wanted to participate and the narrowness of the road, the court order said that only 300 people could participate in a 21-mile stretch of the 54 miles that went through a certain county that had a more narrow road. But they weren't limited at the beginning or the end of the march. So Tom, our rector at the time, was really very inspired by Martin Luther King, by his witness for a number of years before he decided to go to Selma. I'm sure he had been talking about it and preaching about it as well. But he had a real strong sense that from these words that Martin Luther King had sent out, that because he was able to go and because he had the desire in his heart to participate, that it would be wrong, it would be even sinful if he did not go. He felt that strongly about the urge to go. And he recognized, especially after James Reeb's death, that he was taking on risk. But he felt that was necessary because the way that he put it was that our Black brothers and sisters bear this risk every single day, and I can go for just a few days as my small part to help and to bear that risk in a small way alongside them. So I have a little timeline here of what happened, and it kind of tells the story also of what was happening in the march. So Tom left here on the 17th of March, and by air, and arrived in Montgomery. And he said that there were people who were meeting every plane and every bus and every train, volunteers of the movement who were shepherding people back to the headquarters. Actually, it wasn't just the AME Zion Church, but the Baptist Church and another one as well that were hosting people. And the reason was, if you'll remember the coverage from a few years before that in Montgomery of the buses arriving, the integrated buses, and the way people were attacked and bombed and things like that. And so they had a strong sense of, we want to try to protect folks and make sure that they arrive safely. And so there were all these volunteers who were going out, and that itself was dangerous. A Black woman from Selma was shot and killed after the march when she was transporting folks back to the airport. So he arrives. He's shuttled with others to safety into the Black neighborhood in Selma, and meets up at the church. And there's food there for everybody, so folks can come and eat at the church, at any of these three churches that are hosting people. There are literally thousands of people that are arriving in Selma every day who are being cared for. And then he's assigned to host family. So the folks in the community themselves, that couldn't get hotels or rooms in the white section of town, and there wasn't enough places for people to stay. And so people were sleeping on the floors of the churches and the church halls and gymnasiums, and they were also being taken into people's homes. So he was taken in by a family. He stayed with them. He was in Selma for 8 days. And he didn't mention their names or where they lived or anything about them for fear that there would be attacks against them if they were known to have harbored outsiders. So he's taken in by a family and fed and cared for, and the next day he jumps right in joining with others in a demonstration. So there were 15 people that had been held overnight in the courthouse, in the county jail. And so they went to picket at the county jail. And the governor, under a great deal of pressure, Governor Wallace, had said that it was legal to peacefully protest anywhere in the state of Alabama. This was after all of this violence had occurred against people who were peacefully picketing. And so they actually had a permit to protest in front of the jail, and so nobody gave them any trouble. There were almost 400 people there. But then they decided they were going to push that governor's order and see just how far it went. So they decided to move the protest to the mayor's house. So when they got to the mayor's house, the police came and arrested all of them. So there were 354 who were arrested, including Tom. He said, George was telling me Tom had a penknife in his pocket he'd forgotten about. And so people in the crowd of all these folks who were getting arrested, a lot of them had been arrested before. And they said, hey, make sure you don't have any weapons, make sure you don't have any weapons. And so Tom reached into his pocket and was like, oh no, I have a knife. And so they passed the knife through the crowd to the nearest trash can and threw it away so that he wouldn't get into trouble. But they loaded them up on a school bus, and there was no room, obviously, in the jail for 354 people. So they took them to an armory gymnasium structure and kept them overnight there. The next morning, realizing that literally none of these folks had committed a crime. So the police told them that they hadn't actually been arrested. They had only been detained for their own safety. So as I think they were hoping maybe not to get into legal trouble themselves, and so they let the protesters go the next morning. So on March 20th, there had been, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Episcopal Church's involvement in the civil rights movement as well, but there's an organization within the Episcopal Church that was really looking for opportunities to promote integration and civil rights within the church as well as within society. And so they saw this as an opportunity. They knew Episcopal ministers were gathering in Selma. So they decided to go they wanted to go to St. Paul's Church, Episcopal Church in Selma, which was in the white section of town and was a segregated church. Now in October of 1964, the Episcopal Church had officially ruled that segregation was illegal in the church and was not to happen. And so the Diocese of Alabama, and I'm sure some other dioceses as well, were refusing to comply with that order. So they were continuing to practice segregation in their churches. And so there were a couple bishops that had come to Selma. The presiding bishop actually had been the week before and had also brought attention to issues that were happening. But they decided that they were going to, this group of Episcopal clergy was going to go to this segregated church. They were going to demand to be let in, and if they weren't let in, they were going to say a prayer service on the steps of this church, a penitential order. And they were both black and white ministers together. And they thought, oh, maybe a couple cars is enough to take all of us over there to do this. But as they were leaving the headquarters, you get a feel for just the incredible encouragement and love and camaraderie that was happening in that place. Because, just this maybe dozen people, head out to do a prayer service, and 150 other people are like, no, we want to come too. So now they can't fit in a car or a few cars, they have to walk because they're 150 in number. And so they set out from the church. And at this point in the struggle, the police had set up barricades between the black and white sections of town and were stopping people and trying to prevent them from entering the white side of town. And so as they reached that barricade, 150 people, the director of public safety for the city comes and meets them and tells them, for their own safety, they cannot proceed. Now he did have police. Police weren't right there. They were kind of hanging back so as not to instigate anything. But the great march to Montgomery was going to happen on the 21st, which was the very next day. And so folks didn't want to get arrested and miss the march. So they decided that they weren't going to push it and try to cross that barricade and get to St. Paul's Church. So instead, they had this wonderful interaction with the city public safety officer, and there's an audio recording of it in the actual noise of that crowd in the Episcopal Church archives. I put a link to it on our website as well. It's neat to get the sound from that, and it's the same tactic that they used, that the movement used in every single confrontation, and that was incredible respect and dignity that they were treating the people who were stopping them, but also asking them pointed and difficult questions about why it was that they were behaving the way that they were, and if they would allow this crowd of people to pray for them, or if they would join them in prayer. And so this man is very defensive, and he prays to his own God, and they can pray to theirs, kind of an attitude which they met a lot. But they go ahead and start right there on the street, the order of penitential prayer, right from the prayer book. And they get through the first part of the service, and then they head back to the AME Zion Church to finish the service, to do communion. And outside, at that point, even more people had gathered. So there were about 300 people outside the church for this Episcopal service. And they had communion, and some other people that were there reflected on just the incredible joy in the singing, the presence of the Spirit in this crowd, and the way that they felt just so enlivened and connected to one another. And by the end of that service, there were 30 police cars that were surrounding the crowd, expecting some kind of trouble. Nobody was arrested, so they were good to go the next day for the great march. So it started out with about 8,000 people, and Martin Luther King gave a speech to encourage folks before they marched. And this time, when they crossed over the bridge, there was not a barricade of police, but rather they were being led by the National Guard, the U.S. Marshals, FBI agents as well. I mean, some estimates were several thousand folks who were just there to protect the marchers along this 54-mile route. So they marched the first day 8 miles through the city and out of town, and they were marching 6 people wide. It was very organized, and it was not just like a crowd of people kind of moving along. And it was silent, which was different than some other marches that had happened. I'm sure there were some people talking and maybe some singing as well, but there was no kind of official loud singing because they didn't want to provoke the people that had come to line the streets. Tom reflected on being kicked and spat at, having just verbal assaults hurled at him all along the route and throughout his time doing in these demonstrations that he participated in. But it was just an incredibly inspiring sight to see 8,000 people walking together in unison. So you reach a campground at the end of that one day's march, and then the next section is going to be that section where only 300 people are allowed to proceed. And so they had decided that though thousands wanted to proceed, that only the people who had been through Bloody Sunday were going to be the ones to bear the movement through those 21 miles. So there was just, I believe, only one Episcopal clergy person among their number at that point. So Tom had to turn back with the thousands of others and head back to Selma. They had buses and cars that came and picked them up and took them back. And so he's able to return to his host family and stay overnight. So now what's he going to do as the march is continuing on, through this section and the eyes of the nation continue to be on that march and what's happening. And so he helped out. And this was the case with thousands of other volunteers as well. So they came to march and to show their support to the movement. And they spent time picking up trash and painting fences and doing all sorts of community service projects. So he spent a day doing community service projects, and then he spent a day at the movement headquarters answering phones in the press office as well, because they needed folks doing all sorts of things. He then went on to Montgomery, so the march is still going on. So he must have passed them on the way in a car to Montgomery in order to help out with the preparations that were being made there to receive the marchers once they came. So it wasn't just what was going to happen on the steps of the Capitol, but there were events all over town. There were famous entertainers that were coming from different parts of the country to give concerts and to just really continue to both to be a part of the movement, but also to support this, the attention of the nation being on what was happening there. So he stayed up all night at a church in Montgomery, erecting a stage that was going to be used for entertainment. And he said they made it out of empty caskets, 60 empty caskets that they stacked on top of each other and put plywood on top of. Interesting little detail. But he was up all night, and then the next morning wanted to join the march to Montgomery as it drew closer to the city. And so at that point, the march had swelled to 25,000 people as they came for the last day and a half of the march. I'm not sure, it didn't say in his writings if Tom was able to stay, because he left the day that they arrived. So I'm not sure if he was able to stay and hear the speeches. But as soon as they arrived at the Capitol, Martin Luther King gave his famous "How long, not long" speech there, which is certainly one of his most famous speeches. And that sense. There was a sense among people that what they had accomplished was hopefully a turning point. Lyndon Johnson spoke, he called actually a joint session of Congress during the time. It was actually after Bloody Sunday and before the march was able to happen. He called a joint session of Congress just to draw attention to what was happening in Selma. And I want to find the quote actually that he said, because it was really important. He said, so to Congress, he said, so now again, this is during the Civil Rights Movement, a white president speaking to a mostly white Congress that has been in conflict a lot of times with the movement. And he says, all of us must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. So it was certainly the first time that that an elected official at that level had used the words of the movement. So "We Shall Overcome" had really become the anthem of the movement. And somebody who was with Martin Luther King at the time said that that it caused Martin Luther King to cry, hearing the president say those words to a joint session of Congress. That he really felt in that moment that there was a shift in the tides. So in that time, they proposed a Voting Rights Act. It wasn't passed until later that summer, but it was passed in direct sequence because of what happened in Selma, because of the work that people did there, and what they were willing to risk, and the attention that they were willing to draw to the situation that happened. So Tom came home on the 25th, which was the same day the marchers arrived in Montgomery. And on the 28th, he preached a sermon here in this building. And I read a good portion of it out a few weeks ago in honor of Martin Luther King Day. And it was a really important sermon. Folks knew that he had gone. He had gone away for 8 days, and there was some discontent among a certain number of members over his involvement. They felt he was being too political. They felt his work was in Napa, and what was he doing going to Selma? And they were very happy to tell him exactly what they thought. and so he starts the sermon with a little bit of a sarcastic dig at them. He said that I know some of you may, because it was during the season of Lent, he said, I know some of you may, lest you think that I have given up my parish for Lent as my Lenten discipline. And then he said, I appreciate your concern. in the text, he put quotations around concern. But he went on to preach a really fiery sermon, really saying directly, defending his actions, not actually talking a lot about his own experience in Selma, but defending his reason for going, and also the Episcopal Church's involvement in the civil rights movement, and classifying it as a Christian imperative, that we are required by our faith to participate and to stand with our brothers and sisters. And he promised at the end of the sermon that he would return if the need was there. So it's hard to say exactly the impact that it had on the parish in terms of the angry folks that left. We know that there were some. Tom was receiving angry threats, anonymous threats by phone. George remembers not being allowed to answer the phone for more than a year afterwards because of the threats that he was receiving. He even quotes one of the threats in his sermon because he wanted the congregation to know just the incredible hatred that was present in our own community here in Napa, and that this isn't just a problem of the South, but rather a problem in our whole nation. So now I've lost my train of thought. It just went blank. So the threats that he was receiving. So it was definitely, it was not just something that happened that once, but certainly something that continued to have an impact. But I think that it actually may have just galvanized his resolve. By looking at the numbers, the parish register numbers in terms of the folks that were coming to church, it looks to me that as many as about a quarter of the congregation left that year, probably because of Tom's involvement in the civil rights movement. But I'm sure that there was a lot of people also that came because of it. It's possible. I don't know of any other person from Napa who went to Selma during the march to Montgomery. So he might have been the only one. And there certainly was a front page article about him when he returned. It says Napa returns from or describes racial incidents in Selma. So there certainly was a way in which other people heard about what it was that he had done and were interested in it. But I think that just his absolute resolve to stick with it and to say, no, that this is a matter of what it means to be Christian, really inspired a generation of folks in our church. And I certainly was still hearing about it when I came 3 years ago. It's a part of the memory of who we are as a congregation, that we weathered that difficulty and stood strong, not just as the rector saying this is what we should do, but really as the community embracing and receiving that message and saying, yes, this is what is right. This is what we ought to be doing. So on that same day, March 28th, when Tom is here preaching his sermon, there was the first ever integrated service at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Selma, Alabama. So in response to that, the call and attention that group brought to the fact that they were still refusing to abide by the canons of the church and do away with segregation. The rector and the vestry of that church voted to go against the bishop and to integrate their church. So that was something that the Episcopal or the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church at the time then sent out a kind of a statement to the whole church saying we need to celebrate what's happened today in Selma in Selma, Alabama. So I wanted to also just give you a little information about the Episcopal Church's involvement in general, and then I'll take some questions. So the Episcopal Church in 1919. So the way that we're structured, we have our General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and Peter and myself are both deputies to that body. There are several representatives from every diocese around the church that go, and it's only once every 3 years that we get together. And at those meetings, we go through all kinds of legislation. It's things that pertain to the church and the running of the church, but also the church's official stance on various different issues that we decide. And so our church has a long history of being participating in General Convention, because Stephen Carpenter was a deputy for many years to convention, and Tom also had been a deputy to convention before him. So we've gotten to be part of some really, I think, historic decisions directly in the Episcopal Church. So the first one of note that I would like to say is in the year 1919, the Episcopal Church came out with a resolution stating against lynching and really calling attention to the sin of lynching that was happening in our country. And you may or may not know that there's about 3,000 people were killed by lynching in our country in the space of about 100 years. So it was just an incredibly terrible part of our history. But at 1919, it was still very much going on frequently and was being lifted up and celebrated by certain communities. So that was kind of one of the first statements that we had around civil rights. In 1952, the convention voted to pass a statement that was against segregation. So again, fairly early in the civil rights movement, to say that segregation is not the way that we should be in Christian community, not just in our churches, but in society as a whole. And they continued to, and that was in Boston, and Tom was a deputy to that convention. And it really had a profound impact on him. And so he noted and followed the decisions of the conventions that followed that, which continue to strengthen and support that language. In 1959, the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity was founded. And that becomes an interracial group that really is pushing for change within the church. And they take on a lot of the same tactics of the civil rights movement organizers in nonviolence. So they forcibly integrate churches. They integrate buses on their way to General Convention. They go to Episcopal schools and Episcopal hospitals and point out racist practices that were happening in those places. So they were a really important group in terms of bringing attention to the eyes of the church of its own sins, as well as seeing how we could participate in changing the community around us. And Barbara Harris, she was the first woman made a bishop in the entire Anglican Communion anywhere in the world, and that was in 1989 in Massachusetts. We have her picture up on the bulletin board. She was the president of this group for a number of years, Peter and I got to vote to make her a saint in the church last summer, which was very exciting, and one of the few times they allowed us to clap, because we're not allowed to clap usually when we pass resolutions. But she's involved in the movement heavily at this time in the Episcopal Church. In 1963, the presiding bishop calls the whole church to, quote, maximum participation in the civil rights movement. And the Episcopal Church was at that time also actively involved in planning the March on Washington with other organizations, obviously, that were the lead of that. And then, of course, I already mentioned in 1964 how they outlawed segregation within the church. At that convention also, Martin Luther King came to the Episcopal Church's convention and spoke there to a crowd of 2,000 people. So after the involvement in Selma, so it wasn't just the clergy that came, but there were folks that were staying around to help the organizers and to continue the work, because, of course, continuing the voting rights work and getting people registered to vote, it was happening after the march was over, and it was important that they make sure that presence stayed there. So the Episcopal Church made a commitment to the local organizers that they would have at least several people present there to continue to help with logistics and anything that they needed for as long as they needed them. So they funded those positions through our national church office. And there were some seminarians, one of them named Jonathan Daniels, who had come also to the march and been a part of what happened in the voting rights demonstrations. He must have been on spring break, I'm guessing, at the time in early March, and was really moved by his experience there, and decided, along with other seminarians, to come back and spend their summer in Selma in order to continue the work. So he was staying in Selma with a family and was involved in demonstrations all throughout the county. And he was shot and killed protecting the life of a young woman who he was with. So they had gone as a group to get some snacks at a convenience store, and on their way out of the store, a former deputy had a shotgun on him, and he pointed it at this 14-year-old black young woman. And Jonathan quickly pushed her out of the way and took the full blast of the shotgun at close range and was killed instantly. So he was remembered as a saint in our church. He was the 26th civil rights worker killed in the South during the civil rights movement. So one of many. But certainly somebody who brought attention also to what was happening there, and the importance to continue with the work. So there were, this is interesting. So the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, in 1966, they officially charged the Episcopal Church with heresy due to racism. So it's an interesting thing because it's using old language, right? But to try to shock and get people to understand just how deeply we have sinned and how much we need to call these things to attention. Over 10,000 Episcopalians signed on to that petition, which was brought to General Convention. And then they, in fact, held a special General Convention in 1960. So out of the 3-year cycle, they held a special convention just to address the sins of racism within the church. And they decided, at that point, women were still not seated as deputies in the House of Deputies. We didn't get the right to vote in this denomination until 1970. So the year before that happens, they held this convention, and they decided there was no way they could have a convention of mostly white men to talk about the sin of racism. And so they invited guest deputies, women and more people of color, to make it a more diverse body. And a lot of good work happened there. So the work has continued. It didn't stop with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. There has been certainly an increase in the movement in our own country. So in 2020, it was the largest movement of people in the streets for the civil rights movement in our nation's history in response to George Floyd's murder. And even before that, the Episcopal Church had been working. And so in 2006, we officially named racism as a sin and apologized for our participation in the slave trade and in other racist endeavors. Michael Curry is made our presiding bishop, who still is until next summer, he's still our presiding bishop. It's a 9-year term. In 2015, he's the first black man to be our presiding bishop, and has really just inspired an incredible amount of work within our church, embracing Jesus, the way of love, and also looking at healing from racism. So in 2016, Michael Curry went to Standing Rock. If you'll remember the demonstrations that were happening there on tribal land over water rights and the movement of a oil pipeline through their area. That was the largest gathering of Native American tribes in our country's history. There were more than 300 tribes present there. And he came and he showed up there. And while he was there, he said, "This is the Selma of our time." And so that had a profound effect on the Episcopal Church, who remembered our involvement in Selma. And so the local Episcopal Church there in Standing Rock, there is an Episcopal church there, invited clergy from around the country to come. And within a few days, 400 Episcopal clergy and seminarians showed up at Standing Rock to participate in prayerful demonstrations. And I was among that number. I was a seminarian at the time. And I was with 9 others who came from our seminary, and we were directly inspired by Mike. We wouldn't have been there if it weren't for Michael Curry. In a similar way, I don't think Tom would have been in Selma if it weren't for Martin Luther King, giving that invitation. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to participate in an official reading of a General Convention resolution to apologize for our participation in the Manifest Destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, the stealing of tribal lands, and also the Indian boarding schools that the Episcopal Church was also a part of. And it had never actually been read aloud to a group of Indigenous people before, so it was an incredibly moving experience. And those folks who received that confession and desire forgiveness then put us through a ceremony of forgiveness. It was really beautiful. A lot of the news about what happened there was very twisted. I will say, as a person who was actually there was just an incredible amount of beauty and forgiveness and hope that was happening there. So in 2019, the Episcopal Church launched a curriculum called Sacred Ground that was initially designed for white people to talk with other white people about race, but has now been understood to be a wonderful forum for people from all different races to have conversations. And there have been more than 20,000 Episcopalians that have graduated from this program. It's at least 11 weeks. We did it over 22 because it's really intense and there's a lot of homework involved. But that's just an astounding number of people. We are not a large church, folks. we have less than 2 million people in our church. So folks have really participated and been a part of that, and it continues to grow. There are more and more people take this class every year. And we will be offering, we did it in 2020, and we'll be offering it again this year as well. We're in conjunction with the other Episcopal churches in the Valley. And then last summer, the convention that Peter and I were at, the Episcopal, there was some real good work that was done around racism, and money this time was committed. Not just statements about things that we're going to do, but money was set aside to research and look into the Episcopal Church's involvement, both in slavery as well as Jim Crow segregation and the Indian boarding schools as well. We have incredible archives, apparently one of the best among Christian denominations. So we have a lot of information to look through and really see what is the impact of the sinful actions of our church. The point of that is not to beat ourselves up, but rather the only way that we can heal is if the wounds are opened and that good healing ointment is beginning to be applied. There was also a lot of talk about reparations, and some different dioceses talked about work that they were already doing. We were hosted by the Diocese of Maryland, and their bishop, who is African American, gave just a really inspiring talk where he said, look, I'm benefiting as a bishop of the church. I'm benefiting from some segregationist and racist policies and slavery that have happened over the years, even though I'm a black man, he said. And so I think it's part of my duty to give back and make sure that we all are doing the same. It was just really in a no-nonsense way. He said, we can't all be good at everything. He's like, but I think in our diocese we figured this thing out. But anyway, a lot of good work happened there. Let me check the time. All right, I'm going to stop the video really quick and then take your questions.